Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Dissenter Weekly Show. I'm Kevin Gostola, the managing editor for Shadowproof, and we've got some major developments with WikiLeaks and the grand jury, and Chelsea Manning was released from jail. And obviously, we are all trying to survive a global pandemic right now, but the show goes on, and since I'm self-quarantining and Brian is self-quarantining, we can do these kinds of shows. And in fact, maybe with all the self-quarantining that is going on, we should be doing more shows to keep you all informed and entertained. So who knows, maybe you'll be hearing more from me than ever before because of this pandemic. But Brian's got some things for you before we get on to we have a very specifically focused show for this week.
Yeah, very busy show for this week. A lot of very interesting and important news. Before we jump in, I just wanted to remind folks, if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel so that you can find out whenever we're going live with a show. Follow us on Facebook. We're streaming on there as well. We are also on Twitter. And I just wanted to remind folks that we are a 100% reader-supported independent journalism outlet. Everything that we do relies on the donations of individuals like you. The average donation to our website is between like $5, $10, $20. So every little bit helps. If you appreciate the show, if you appreciate our reporting, what Kevin does with whistleblowers and press freedom, please go to shadowproof.com/donate and help us out. With that, Kevin, I think we should just dive right in to the first bit of, I guess, good news, that we have here on the show in a while. Chelsea Manning is to be released from jail. Can you talk about where we're at with Chelsea right now?
So what we know is that she was released from jail, and I think it is completely fair to spin this as a victory for grand jury resistance because she maintained her resolve. It took an incredibly traumatic toll on her just a day before she was released from jail. We know that she attempted suicide, and we do not have a lot of details involving the circumstances of what happened in her jail cell, but we know that she was in the hospital recovering. And that was a news item before we had this development where Judge Anthony Trenga ordered Chelsea Manning to be released. She had been in jail for around a year, almost exactly a year. The grand jury, if you recall, back in 2019, she was in jail at the detention center in Alexandria, Virginia. She was released. And then there was a week there where she was subpoenaed again to appear before the WikiLeaks grand jury. This grand jury set up to basically destroy a media organization. It's the grand jury that indicted Julian Assange, WikiLeaks founder. And presumably we thought that they were investigating other people within WikiLeaks. We'll get to that later, but we know that she was in jail for almost exactly a year. And there also was a fine system that was imposed, a fines regime, we could say, that was imposed upon her, whereby for 30 days she would be fined $500 a day. And then after that, she would be fined $1,000 a day for refusing to go testify before this grand jury. And so she racked up in her time in jail $256,000 worth of fines. That's $250,000 that she has as a debt to the government, which cruelly kept her in jail, even though, we have to say this, even though they did not need any of her testimony to indict Julian Assange. They went forward with the indictment against him, and they kept her in jail trying to get her to inform against Assange, trying to get her to be brought before them to testify, to say whatever they wanted her to say, to trip her up, to make her stumble and fumble and bumble around and contradict her statement that she gave to a military court back in 2013. And yet they could not get her to bend. They could not get her to break in such a way that she begged for mercy and came crawling to them and decided to give testimony. But in maintaining this resolve and standing on her principles in challenging the grand jury, that had a great impact on her. We have really no idea how severe the impact was, but we know that going forward, we are probably going to learn that it took a tremendous toll on her mental health, that what she was going through amounted to psychological torture, that it set her back in the kinds of healthcare treatments that she had been receiving for her transition into becoming a transgender woman, that the kinds of hormone therapies or any sorts of other treatment that she was receiving, that she probably had a difficult time maintaining the kinds of hygiene that she's expected to maintain in order to stay healthy, and that she's going to need to have procedures done now because of what she went through in her time in jail, being targeted by the U.S. government. So we know the good news, which is she's out of jail. She's going to be with her support network. There's a support network of people that are raising funds to help her pay for this incredible fine that Judge Trenga still maintains Chelsea Manning is able to pay without any evidence. There's absolutely no evidence that Chelsea Manning is capable of paying $250,000. We don't know if there's going to be some kind of schedule for payments. Is a debt collector going to come knocking right away? What sort of duress is this going to mean? She's leaving jail basically destitute and impoverished. She doesn't have an apartment. She has maybe some things that were stored in a storage facility locker. But by and large, she left jail homeless, and she has to figure out what to do now in order to return to the community in which she was a part. And if you recall, back in 2017, she was released after serving 6 years of a 35-year sentence. That was her returning to the community. That was her reintegrating into society, and she was doing the best that she could. She was writing a book. She appeared in a documentary that premiered on Showtime last year called XY Chelsea. And so there were all of these things that she was doing. She was speaking. She was going around doing events, and she even tried a campaign for the U.S. Senate. And so she was engaged and was a voice and an activist that people were looking to, not just on matters related to her case, but on matters that were related to other issues of social, economic justice, etc. So, and speaking out on the way that transgender people are treated in prison was something that Chelsea Manning was doing. And I hope that voice can come back. But in the meantime, it's clear that she needs this time to heal and recover. And her lawyers have asked for privacy so that she can resume her life. And so obviously all we can say is that we wish her the best, and that what she's done is tremendously inspirational, because not only was she taking a stand against the abusive grand jury process, but as a journalist, I have to say that recognizing what the threat of this case against Julian Assange is, she was taking a stand for press freedom. And so in deciding to be jailed, in deciding to not cooperate with the grand jury, she was engaged in an act of heroism for all journalists who are threatened by this government not recognizing the boundary, going across it, deciding that they are going to pursue the extradition and put Julian Assange on trial in the United States if they are able to do so.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you for your reporting on this last night. I was very pleased to see you get out the news when it came out. And we will definitely continue to stay with the story as you have for many years now. Definitely wishing Chelsea the best, and just also very grateful that you pointed out both how this, this decision comes on the heels of her torture, and really just an ongoing campaign, even in spite of her commutation under Barack Obama, just an ongoing campaign of punishment and repression for her even after her release from incarceration. So thank you very much. We have more stories related to this involving Jeremy Hammond as well. Why don't you let us know what's going on here?
So we know, and admittedly, I've covered this less extensively than Chelsea Manning, but that's largely owed to the fact that I spent such an extensive amount of time in my career on the Chelsea Manning case. So I was hitting her particular case much more aggressively. But Jeremy Hammond is still important to highlight, was released, and he has now been returned to the Bureau of Prisons custody. He is there going to resume his sentence. We do not know exactly when he would be out of prison, but let's keep in mind that he was expected to be leaving prison at the end of last year, I believe, and he had been part of a substance abuse program that was giving him some good time credit. And by subpoenaing him and forcing him to go appear before this grand jury, it disrupted that, and I think he lost some of the good time that he was supposed to have from going through this program. And of course, for those people who do not know, Jeremy Hammond was involved in the hack against the Stratfor private intelligence firm, or they describe themselves as an intelligence firm. They were largely a bunch of amateurs who believed that their connections to people in different places like corporations or parts of the government made them intelligence analysts, so to speak, who could speak on world issues, who could analyze world events and provide reporting, intelligence reports for people to determine what to do, and whether it meant profiting or recognizing security risks. And all of these documents, these emails from people at Stratfor were published by WikiLeaks, and Jeremy was involved in that and was prosecuted, and also was in the target of an FBI informant named Sabu. And we won't get into all of that, but just to say that the FBI played a role, and they were, to some degree, there's evidence that they were trying to entrap people and that they knew what was going on, and they really were hoping that this would be a way to get to people within the WikiLeaks organization. So Jeremy was hauled before the grand jury, and they very desperately wanted to have him testify. And notably, if he had testified, it would have been on evidence that's unrelated to anything that is in the indictments against Julian Assange thus far. So it could have meant something very significant for the government. It could have meant something significant for the WikiLeaks legal team that's representing Julian Assange. So thus far to date, everything that we've seen brought as far as crimes against Julian Assange are focused to the 2010-2011 time frame, which is when those disclosures were published: the collateral murder video, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan war logs, the Guantanamo detainee files, the massive cache of over 250,000 cables from the U.S. State Department. And so that's been the focus. And those were leaks that were widely lauded. Human rights organizations celebrated those disclosures, and WikiLeaks was revered for publishing this information. And it's a credit to Chelsea Manning that this information was published. So, I mean, again, I emphasize that just because the fact that we have a criminal case unfolding related to these disclosures says a lot about the audacity of this government, because they're going up against WikiLeaks and challenging the organization and challenging its founder and prosecuting and putting him through what we're going to get into, the kind of mistreatment he's enduring, in spite of the fact that there's praise out there and has been praise out there for their work.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think this flows, what you were just saying about Jeremy and what you were just telling us about Chelsea flows into the next piece that we have here, which is that the WikiLeaks grand jury has been dismissed now. What's the significance of this? And, can you just tell people a little bit more about why it matters?
Yeah, and I think the significance for that is if I'm basically reading what the judge wrote in the order, I mean, it says that this grand jury was discharged. The grand jury had not completed its 18-month term. And had it completed the 18-month term, it could have then been impaneled again, and it could have continued on to put together indictments against Julian Assange. Well, not Julian Assange. Well, it could add additional charges against Julian Assange. But I mean, there could have been people who are within the WikiLeaks organization who are known people. One of them prominently who has come up is Sarah Harrison, who had engaged in work for WikiLeaks. She's seen in the Risk documentary that Laura Poitras produced that is available on Netflix. And there's other individuals that are connected who have been involved in this work, and potentially they could have been indicted if there was any kinds of evidence that could be brought that could form the basis of political cases, additional political cases against WikiLeaks staff or affiliates, people who have been associated with WikiLeaks. And yet dismissing this is a signal to me that there's not going to be any additional indictments. And I think it's really that basic. Obviously, people who are highly skeptical and rightfully cynical about the US government and the Trump administration and the Obama administration, and they are fundamentally, they are well in tuned to the war on whistleblowers. They know the extent to which this government has clamped down on leaks and the free flow of information and been no friend of transparency activists. We know that they could any moment decide to start up another grand jury and potentially investigate other aspects of the history of publications by WikiLeaks. They could investigate other aspects of what WikiLeaks did. But then again, that gets to the secrecy around this grand jury process. We don't know how focused the grand jury was in their investigation. Was this grand jury only looking at 2010 and 2011? If it subpoenaed Jeremy Hammond, then they were going to look at other disclosures outside of just this time frame, which means that they could have looked at anything related to the Podesta emails in 2016, the DNC emails. They could have looked at Vault 7 materials related to publishing those, which we're going to actually get to a story connected to that later in our show. But in fact, they didn't issue additional indictments, and there wasn't anything more. And Chelsea Manning wasn't going to provide additional evidence for this, and so we see that it's been dismissed. And I think that if you are part of the WikiLeaks legal team, if you're part of WikiLeaks, you quietly breathe a sigh of relief, because perhaps this means that all stops and ends with trying to nail Julian Assange. And so now you can focus all of your energy, if you're part of WikiLeaks, if you're part of that WikiLeaks legal team, you just focus your energy on trying to stop the government from extraditing Julian Assange to the United States.
Thank you. You mentioned Vault 7. I wanted to move on to that now. And you and I were talking before we started about how, sort of in a good way, this is a very unusual thing that we haven't really seen yet. Can you tell us about the what's going on with the mistrial in the Vault 7 case?
Yeah, so in the last few days, we have this news that in New York, and this comes from Inner City Press. Inner City Press, their independent journalism, they've been one of the only people, I think his name's Matthew, he's been one of the only people who has been reporting on this trial. And obviously there's a lot going on with coronavirus, but still, the fact that there's like only one place where you can get good information about what's happening in this trial, it says a lot about our media, because this is substantial. Potentially here, we have the one case in the last 10 or so years that the government failed to convict someone of Espionage Act allegations. There are just two charges. They're minor. They involve false statements and possibly obstruction of justice. But I'm seeing that he was even accused of a child pornography charge that fell apart, that they weren't able to prove. That's pretty substantial. And I don't think they were able to conclusively prove that he was the leaker of this information. That's something that his attorney challenged. So his name's Joshua Schultz, the Vault 7 leaker, alleged leaker, unproven. It seems like he's probably not the guy. And we pointed out that it was probably possible that he wasn't the person. Behaviorally, we'd seen reporting that said he had wanted to. He had talked about Edward Snowden and how the government should execute Edward Snowden. Allegedly, this was attributed to him. And that didn't quite, in my mind, fit someone who would go and release these cyber hacking tools, information about them, reveal them to the world, provide information to WikiLeaks. This suggests that the government has a problem. Not a problem I'm going to be helping them solve, but a problem in the sense that they don't know who gave this information to WikiLeaks. And to the extent that they were unable to prove this case, it shows that they were desperate, that they wanted to nail someone. And so this is a major development, that this trial unfolded and the jury saw through what the prosecution was saying. And so in the end, you have two relatively minor counts that are going to stick. That will be on his record, but he already has served a substantial amount of time in confinement prior to this trial. So it's unlikely that he will be in prison for very long after being sentenced, because these are the kinds of offenses he's facing are 1 to 2 year counts. That's the sort of time frame I think it gets attached. These are the sort of like process crimes that people get charged with in order so prosecutors can salvage their case. And we've seen that in a lot of the cases related to Russiagate.
Thank you for that. I'd like to move on now to some stories we have regarding Julian Assange directly. We have the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute condemning Assange's abuse. Can you talk about this for us?
Yeah, so this is an important deal for the International Bar Association to come forward. And I'll go ahead and just quote what we have the co-chair, Michael Kirby, saying that the Institute is concerned that the mistreatment of Julian Assange constitutes breaches of his right to a fair trial and protections enshrined in the United Nations Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, to which the United Kingdom is a party. It is deeply shocking that as a mature democracy in which the rule of law and the rights of individuals are preserved, the UK government has been silent and has taken no action to terminate such gross and disproportionate conduct by Crown officials. As well, we are surprised that the presiding judge has reportedly said and done nothing to rebuke the officials and their superiors for such conduct in the case of an accused whose offense is not one of personal violence. Many countries in the world look to Britain as an example in such matters. On this occasion, the example is shocking and excessive. It is reminiscent of the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, which can happen when prison officials are not trained in the basic human rights of detainees, and the Nelson Mandela rules. So then he goes on to remind the UK that they are party to the Human Rights Act, that they should ensure a fair trial, that Assange is entitled to freedom from torture and inhuman or degrading treatment, and that they also have a right to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal. So then another co-chair goes on, her name's Anne Ramberg, to say that they concur with the widespread concern over the ill treatment of Assange. He must be afforded equality and access to effective legal representation. With his extradition trial, we are witnessing the serious undermining of due process and the rule of law. It's troubling that Assange has complained he is unable to hear properly what is said at his trial, and that because he is locked in a glass cage, he is prevented from communicating freely with his lawyers during the proceedings commensurate with the prosecution. So speaking out against what we said and have covered here at Shadowproof, that he's basically in this glass box at the back of the courtroom, isolated and unable to be a participant in his defense, which undermines his due process rights.
Thank you, Kevin. We have one last story here involving Doctors for Assange. This is a group that I believe that we've heard from over the last several weeks, if I'm remembering that correctly, and please correct me if
Yeah.
I'm wrong. They have put out another statement, it looks like. Can you talk to us about this?
Yeah, so I mean, this one is coming it comes after the UK has insisted that there is no torture, that they are not responsible for whatever is happening to Julian Assange. So we've got an even more direct, pointed, and it's very strong in its condemnation of the way in which the UK government is handling this case. It was in the Lancet, which is a very well-respected, popular medical journal. And, it may have only been posted on the website for the Lancet, but still, using the name the Lancet to promote this and call for the end of torture and medical neglect of Julian Assange. And what I'll just quickly run down here before we wrap is that they've warned the UK Home Secretary of what Julian Assange is experiencing. They've pointed to concerns expressed by UN Special Rapporteur on Torture Niels Meltzer. These warnings were not of any interest to the UK government. They very inadequately responded to these concerns. Disturbingly, the doctors have learned the extent to which he was abused and mistreated while in the Ecuador embassy. And so they very clearly state here, we condemn the torture of Assange. We condemn the denial of his fundamental right to appropriate health care. We condemn the climate of fear surrounding the provision of health care to him. We condemn the violations of his right to doctor-patient confidentiality. Politics cannot be allowed to interfere with the right to health and the practice of medicine. In the experience of the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, the scale of state interference is without precedent. Quote, in 20 years of work with victims of war, and this is from Meltzer, violence and political persecution, I have never seen a group of democratic states ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonize, and abuse a single individual for such a long time and with so little regard for human dignity and the rule of law. So they invite doctors to sign on as signatories to the letters to amplify their calls, and they put it squarely on the UK. They put it squarely on the UK. Should Assange die in a UK prison, as the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has warned, he will effectively have been tortured to death. Much of that torture will have taken place in a prison medical ward on doctor's watch. The medical profession cannot afford to stand silently by on the wrong side of torture and the wrong side of history while such a travesty unfolds. So it's a very strong letter, important to call more attention to what's going on in Julian Assange's case.
Thank you. Yes, very disturbing, but at least I am glad that there are people in the medical profession who are standing up and organizing in support of Assange. Kevin, I don't know if you have any final thoughts or if you'd like to just wrap up here. I know that a lot of people have their attention being pulled in many different ways today.
Yes, I have to get going to do some more media for Chelsea Manning related to the developments in her case. So I apologize for abruptly wrapping this show. But what I will leave you with is that currently, despite all of what we're seeing with this pandemic and outbreak, I still remain committed to traveling to the UK in May to cover Julian Assange's case. So if you appreciate this reporting, please donate to shadowproof.com. We're building up our base of funds in order to pay for the costs of being there for 3 weeks in May and June to cover the witnesses that are going to be called to this hearing to provide evidence for the defense and for the prosecution related to Julian Assange's case. And I will leave it there. I thank you all for following my work and treating what I say about Chelsea Manning with, there's the response to what I was sharing about Chelsea Manning. It's really nice to know that all of you are out there. The media really isn't covering this case. They did mention that she was released from jail, but this time her struggle and everything she endured over the last year went virtually ignored in the mainstream press. And so it's important to know that there are people like you who are following what we're covering so that these injustices don't unfold without people giving them attention.
Yes. Thank you so much, Kevin. Subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, and if you can support us and help us build up funds for Kevin's trip, please go to shadowproof.com/donate. Thank you all for listening. Take care.